Before you listen to this story, please turn off the lights in your room or make them very dim. Put your phone down, get comfortable, and let your body relax. Take a slow, deep breath, then gently let it go. You do not need to think about your day anymore. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go. Just listen calmly and let my voice guide you. This story is not meant to excite your mind, but to help it slow down. Allow your thoughts to fade, your breathing to become steady, and your body to feel heavy and safe. As the story begins, you can simply rest and slowly drift toward peaceful sleep. In the narrow streets of a small medieval town where the stone church tower cast its long shadow over crooked roofs and muddy lanes, a girl named Elise grew up watching the slow rhythm of life repeat itself, season after season, until it seemed to her that the whole world was made of the same sounds and sights: the clatter of wooden wheels on cobbles, the tolling of bells for mass and market, the smell of baking bread drifting from low, smoky houses, the rustle of coarse linen and wool, as people moved through cramped rooms where entire families ate, worked, and slept together. And from childhood, she understood that in this world, a person's private life, even the deepest kind of closeness between a man and a woman, was never entirely separate from the eyes of neighbors, the rules of the church, and the needs of the household, because everything, from the way people greeted each other at the well to the way they shared a bed at night, was tied to survival, honor, and faith. She slept on a pallet near her parents' bed and learned, without anyone explaining it plainly, that the low murmur of her father's voice and the soft answer of her mother's in the dark had something to do with the babies who arrived every few years, wrapped in scraps of cloth, their cries filling the little house until they grew old enough to be sent to fetch water or gather kindling. And though Elise could not have described it in the language of scholars, she carried silently in her mind the knowledge that when a husband and wife lay close together under the same blanket, they were doing something both ordinary and serious, something allowed and blessed if done within marriage, something that brought new life and could also bring danger, for every woman in the town knew the risks that came with childbirth and the sorrow of small graves outside the churchyard wall. On Sundays, she and the other children stood at the back while the priest spoke in Latin, his voice rising and falling like a distant chant, and then in the common tongue he spoke more clearly about the duties of spouses, about how a man should not neglect his wife and a wife should obey her husband, about how their shared bed was to be honored, not treated carelessly or greedily, and about how the main purpose of their closeness was the making of children who could be raised in the faith, so that even before she knew what a wedding night truly meant in practice, Elise had been told again and again that any kind of physical union outside marriage was sinful, that even within marriage it must be governed by modesty and restraint, and that there were many holy days and seasons when couples should abstain, especially during Lent and Advent, and on the eves of great feasts, a calendar of restraint that wove itself like an invisible net around the sleeping chambers of the town, tightening and loosening with the passing weeks. As she grew older and her hair was braided in the style of young women instead of children, Elise began to notice how women at the well lowered their voices when talking about betrothals and pregnancies. how a hand placed on a swelling belly could draw both smiles and anxious glances, and how a girl cousin, married the year before, now walked more slowly, her back slightly bent, her eyes shadowed by tiredness and a kind of quiet pride, as she spoke of the child that would soon be born. And from these small scenes, Elise understood that intimacy in her world could never be separated from work, from pain, from the long effort to keep a household alive. When Elise reached the age when fathers began to count their coins and mothers looked at their daughters with measuring eyes, her parents started to speak in the evenings, not about far-off saints and kings, but about something closer. Which of the town's apprentices, laborers or small traders might make a suitable husband, not because of charm or handsome looks, but because of the size of his rented room, the steadiness of his wages, the trustworthiness of his kin. And in the winter when she was 16, a man named Tomas began to arrive more often at the smithy where her father worked, bringing orders from a merchant, lingering a little longer than business required, staying respectfully near the door while his eyes drifted toward Elise as she swept the floor or carried charcoal. And her mother noticed this and said nothing at first, only watched, as mothers do, testing in silence how he carried himself, whether he spoke roughly or gently, whether his boots were patched or his tunic torn, measuring these details against years of hard-earned knowledge about who could be relied upon to keep a family fed. In time, words were exchanged between Tomas's uncle and Elise's father, and what was most discussed was not romantic love, but the exact amount of dowry Elise could bring, the chest of linen her mother had slowly woven and stored, a small sum of coins, perhaps the promise of a piglet when spring came, and on Tomas's side, the question of whether he would be able to rent his own small house soon, with its own hearth, and most importantly, its own bed. For in this world the bed was more than furniture. It was the stage upon which adult life would be played, the place where husband and wife would sleep, quarrel, make peace, fall ill, recover, and from which they might one day depart this life. When Elise heard that a match was being considered, she did not swoon or protest in the way of later romantic tales, but sat quietly with her hands clasped, feeling a mixture of fear and calm acceptance. And when her mother asked her in private whether she found Tomas acceptable, whether he had ever frightened her or seemed cruel, Elise thought of the way he had once helped an old man lift a heavy sack, and the shy way he smiled when spoken to, and she replied that he seemed gentle, and that she did not dread the thought of sharing a house with him, and in this simple answer lay all the choice most girls of her time could expect to have. The betrothal was arranged with the priest and a small circle of kin and neighbors as witnesses. Promises were spoken, hands were joined, and over the following months, the talk in both houses shifted toward practicalities, where Tomas and Elise would live, what pots and tools they needed, whether the old straw mattress could be restuffed and made serviceable for the new couple, because for poor townfolk a bed filled with clean straw, covered by a modest linen sheet and woolen blankets, was treasure. And on the day that bed was carried into a rented room above a workshop, Elise watched it as if it were some solemn, patient animal whose back would have to bear the weight of all that was to come. The wedding itself took place at the church door in front of the same building where Elise had been christened as a small child, and where, long before that, her parents had stood making their own vows. And as she and Tomas joined hands again, this time as bride and groom, the priest blessed them, asked whether they would accept each other, and any children God might send, and the small crowd of neighbors hummed with hushed excitement, for a wedding always brought a brief respite from labor, a chance to drink ale together and share a little extra meat and bread. And though no one spoke openly about what would follow in the marriage bed, everyone knew that the joining of hands before the church was only the beginning of a more private bond that would be confirmed later that night. In some noble courts, people made a ceremony of leading the couple to bed, but here in the town, the customs were simpler. After the modest feast, after the jokes of older women about how Elise should not be too frightened and of men who clapped Thomas on the shoulder in rough good humor, the guests drifted away and the newly married pair found themselves walking together for the first time through the sleeping streets as husband and wife, climbing the narrow wooden stairs to the small room that smelled of fresh straw, new wood, and a little of smoke from the hearth below, and when the door shut behind them, the noisy world fell away, leaving only the creak of the floorboards, the faint glow from a tallow candle, and the bed that waited, its linen uneven but clean, its woolen cover heavy with the promise of warmth. They were both shy, because their upbringing had not filled them with bold words about desire, and the church's teaching had wrapped all talk of the body in modesty and caution, so even now, when they were lawfully wed and encouraged to be close, they moved slowly, speaking little, untying laces with unsure fingers, discovering the simple fact of each other's presence without any script, but the half-whispered advice of older relatives and the steady, half-comfort, half-warning that their union was meant for the making of children more than for pursuit of pleasure. In that first year of marriage, Elise learned in practice what she had long suspected in theory, that in medieval times, the intimate life of a couple was woven tightly into everything else, so that it was hard to say where the work of the day ended and the privacy of the night began, because their bed stood in the same room where she spun wool, where Tomas mended his shoes, where they ate their stew from shared bowls and stored their few belongings in a wooden chest, and there were days when exhaustion made them fall asleep side by side without even speaking, soot still clinging to Tomas's hair and flour dusting Elise's sleeves, and other days, especially in the quiet after church, when the pull of closeness was stronger, when they lay awake whispering about the future, about whether God would send them a child, about the rumors of war or plague in distant lands. And on such nights, the physical act that brought their bodies together never stood alone as some separate performance, but melted into the wider feeling of simply not being alone, of having one person in the world whose breath you could hear in the dark, whose hand you could find under the blanket when fear or worry pressed in. The church tried to lay down many rules about when such closeness was permitted. Tomas had heard confessional manuals say that on certain days and seasons, a couple should refrain from sharing the bed in that way, especially on fast days and before receiving the sacrament. And though neither he nor Elise could remember every single restriction, the idea that their bodies were under watch, that even as married folk, they had to be careful not to seem too eager, had sunk into their bones, so that sometimes, when they felt drawn to one another on a night that fell in the middle of Lent, Elise would hesitate and say they ought to wait, fearful of offending heaven, while Thomas would lie awake staring at the dark rafters, torn between his respect for the church and his simple human wish for his wife's nearness. And often they compromised by turning toward each other, holding tight but not going further, a quiet, tender truce between rule and desire that many couples of their time must have known. When Elise's courses failed to come, and she began to feel the strange heaviness and quickening inside her, both she and Thomas understood that their private union had borne visible fruit, and from that moment the character of their intimacy changed again, wrapped now in a thicker layer of worry and hope, because each time a husband and wife in that age conceived a child, they stepped into a dangerous corridor where illness, poor nourishment, or bad luck could snatch away mother, infant, or both. And there was no physician in the town with the kind of knowledge we imagine today. Only old women who knew herbs and saints' days, midwives who had seen countless labors end in joy or mourning, priests who could bless but not heal. In the months that followed, Thomas tried to be more gentle when he reached for Elise in bed, aware that her back ached and her sleep was broken, and Elise, who feared another child might follow too quickly and weaken her body, sometimes turned away with a murmur that they should wait until after the birth, not because she did not love Thomas, but because she was afraid of piling risk upon risk. And in these quiet negotiations, we see how the supposedly simple question of what intimacy was like in that age was complicated by constant calculation. By the thin line, families walked between having enough children to help with labor and losing too many to hunger and disease. Beyond the cramped room where Elise and Thomas lived out their days, in the great stone castle that loomed on the hill, life played out at a grander scale but under similar pressures, for there the lady of the castle, Isabel, and her husband, Lord Renaud, had married not by the choice of their hearts, but by arrangement between powerful families, and on their wedding day, a long procession of knights, clerics and servants had accompanied them from the chapel to a bedchamber hung with rich tapestries and furnished with a high carved bed, where the curtains could be drawn around them like a small private world inside the massive fortress. And yet even here, where cloth was fine and sheets were smooth, the first night of their union was not entirely their own, because attendants waited outside, and in some courts certain witnesses would look for signs in the morning that the marriage had been physically confirmed, eager to be able to say that heirs were now possible, that the alliance between two houses had truly been sealed. Isabel, sent far from her childhood home to marry a man she had met only days before, lay beside Renaud, with a heart filled with homesickness and duty. For she had been taught from infancy that her chief task as a noble wife was to bear sons who could inherit land and title, and if she failed to do so, whispers might arise about her body, or his, or about God's displeasure. And petitions might even be sent to the Pope seeking to dissolve the marriage, as had happened in rare but famous cases when royal unions remained childless, so that every time Isabel and Renaud lay together their closeness was haunted by questions of succession, by the silent scrutiny of the court, by calculations about treaties and dowries, and in this way The most intimate act was transformed into a matter of state. While couples like Elise and Thomas in town and Isabel and Renaud in the castle tried to live rightly within the boundaries set for them, others slipped or rebelled, and the records of medieval courts are filled with cases where men and women were accused of taking lovers outside marriage, of breaking betrothals, of promising themselves to more than one person, of causing scandal when private relations became visible through pregnancies that could not be easily explained. And these cases show that the ideals spoken by priests were often not fully lived, that desire and loneliness sometimes led people into secret meetings in barns, fields, or behind taverns, far from the lawful marriage bed, and when they were discovered, punishments could follow, from fines and penances to harsher penalties in some regions. Yet even then, the law often cared as much about property and inheritance as about morals, since an illegitimate child might throw into doubt who had the right to certain lands or goods. At the edges of this web of marriages, births, and scandals lived men and women who had promised to avoid physical union altogether, monks in rough woolen habits and nuns behind the walls of convents, who took vows of chastity in the belief that giving up the marriage bed brought them closer to God, and in their stone cloisters they slept alone on simple pallets, their days ruled by bells calling them to prayer, reading, and labor, their bodies bound by rules that forbade not only acts, but even certain kinds of touch or familiarity, though in reality some did not always keep these vows. And occasional scandals broke out when monks or nuns were discovered in secret relationships, bringing shame on their houses and feeding debate about whether the human heart could ever fully escape the pull of physical closeness. These religious communities, idealized in sermons as pure and detached, cast a long influence over the rest of society because their example was held up as a kind of shining standard against which the lives of ordinary spouses were measured and often found wanting, so that a married couple like Elise and Thomas could hear in church that while their union was lawful and honorable, the celibate life was higher, and they might walk home wondering how to reconcile the hunger for each other's presence with the message that the most perfect souls turned away from such things altogether. In the town's small tavern, however, away from the solemnity of the church, a different voice could sometimes be heard, bawdy songs sung at harvest or on feast days, joking verses about husbands who were too tired or wives who ruled the house, laughter about cradles rocking soon after weddings, sly hints wrapped in metaphor and old proverbs, and these earthy, joking words formed an unofficial commentary on married life that sat alongside the official teachings, reminding everyone that intimacy was as much a part of being human as eating or sleeping, that no amount of preaching could erase the simple desire to share warmth with another person when winter winds howled or when loneliness grew too heavy. At festivals like May Day in the countryside, young men and women danced around poles wreathed in greenery, went into the woods together to gather branches, and though not every such outing ended in mischief, the symbolism of fertility was strong enough that moralists grumbled and tried to moderate the customs, while villagers smiled knowingly and carried on, blending old pagan echoes of springtime renewal with Christian prayers in a way that gave the intimate side of life a place in the wheel of the year. Doctors and learned men of the era, schooled in the writings of ancient physicians, also had their say on matters of the bed, writing long treatises in Latin about how male and female bodies were formed, about how new life began, about which foods or seasons were best for conceiving healthy children, and their theories, though flawed by our standards, gave medieval people a kind of framework for thinking about their most private relations. They believed that both husband and wife contributed vital elements to conception, that balance between hot and cold, moist and dry within the body, could affect desire and fertility, that too much closeness could weaken a man's strength, and too little could endanger a woman's health. And these ideas flowed from medical books into sermons, advice manuals, and household conversations in simplified form, so that Elise might hear an old midwife say that it was good for a couple to be close sometimes, lest humors become blocked, or that it was best to avoid such union when the moon was in a certain phase, or on nights when one had eaten particular foods. And though she had no way to test these claims, they added yet another layer of thought and superstition to each decision she and Tomas made about how often to reach for each other under the blanket. Years passed, and the town changed in small ways while remaining, at its core, the same. New children ran in the lanes where Elise had once played. More roofs sagged under the weight of age. A fire destroyed one row of houses, and they were rebuilt with borrowed money. Famine came one harsh winter and carried off the weak, and once, when a rumor of distant plague arrived, people whispered in dread and ran to confession, fearing the end of days. Through it all, the intimate lives of couples went on behind doors and shutters, quietly adjusting to each new fear and hope, for when food was scarce or death seemed near, some turned to each other more often for comfort, while others, terrified of bringing children into such a world, drew back and tried to live like brother and sister for a time, believing that self-denial might earn divine protection. And in these choices we see again how the physical union of husband and wife in medieval times was never just about themselves, but always about a larger web of beliefs, fears and expectations that stretched from the smallest house to the mightiest throne. When Elise and Tomas reached old age, their hair gone gray, their backs bent, their children mostly grown and gone to other towns or guilds, their bed once more became a place mainly of rest and shared stories, a wooden island surrounded by a sea of memories, of nights when a storm beat at the shutters and they huddled together listening for leaks in the roof, of the night when one of their sons came home wounded from a brawl and they nursed him between them, of midnights when Elise lay awake thinking of a daughter married far away, wondering how she fared with her own husband, her own bed, her own long path through girlhood, childbirth and beyond. Sometimes, on especially cold evenings, Tomas would still reach for Elise's hand, and they would lie close, not with the urgency of youth, but with a deep, worn-in affection that had survived quarrels, grief, temptation, and the passage of years. And in that quiet embrace, vague and gentle, we can perhaps see more clearly than anywhere else what intimacy in their age truly was. Not a spectacle, not a subject for lurid tales, but a long, mostly hidden thread running through their difficult lives, giving shape and continuity to the human story as surely as any war, invention, or heresy. And if someone standing outside their door in the dark had wondered what was really happening in that narrow bed, the answer would have been simple and complex at the same time. For inside those 4 wooden posts lay the whole of medieval married life in miniature, with all its duties, its restraints, its superstitions, and its small, stubborn tenderness, flickering like a candle flame that burned steadily on, even when the world outside seemed ready to go out.